The moment Johnny Cash first stepped onto the Grand Ole Opry stage in 1956, a beginning that seemed destined for greatness. But the path he took wasn't simple. Behind the icon Man in Black was personal turmoil, dramatic turns, and a conflict with the Opry's establishment. What really happened to Johnny Cash in relation to the Grand Ole Opry? The rise, the rebellion, the fallout, and the comeback. For decades, fans and insiders have swapped stories about Johnny Cash's turbulent relationship with the Grand Ole Opry. Some details are well documented. Others live in that hazy space between memory and myth. And that's where the real intrigue lies. Because behind the official version of events, there are whispers of moments that never made it into the headlines. Moments that reveal a more human, more complicated Johnny Cash. There are many more rumors, untold stories, and lesser-known facts about Johnny Cash, so make sure to watch the video till the end. When Johnny Cash first walked onto the Opry stage, the audience didn't just see another country singer. They witnessed the arrival of a new kind of artist, dressed in black, standing tall with that deep, unmistakable voice. Cash carried with him something raw, something restless. It was the voice of the working man, the prisoner, the sinner seeking redemption. And that night, as he strummed the opening chords of I Walk the Line, the crowd erupted. The Opry, the most sacred stage in country music, had found its next star. But what no one realized was that this moment of triumph would eventually unravel into chaos. Behind that calm, stoic face was a man fighting personal demons, addiction, heartbreak, and a growing rebellion against the very system that once embraced him. The Grand Ole Opry represented everything traditional about country music. Clean-cut, wholesome, and respectful. Johnny Cash? He was the complete opposite. He didn't fit their mold, and he never really tried to. In the years that followed, whispers began to spread. Stories of reckless performances, wild behavior, and that one night that changed everything. The night when Cash, standing on the Opry stage, let his anger and exhaustion take over, leading to an act that would go down in country music legend. It was the night that got him banned from the Opry, and the night that turned the Man in Black into something much bigger than a country star, a symbol of rebellion itself. But was the story really that simple? Was he truly banished from the Opry, or is there more to it? A deeper truth behind the myth. Over the years, versions of that night have been twisted, retold, and romanticized. Fans still debate what really happened between Johnny Cash and the institution that defined his early career. So today, we're uncovering that story. The rise, the fall, the redemption, and the mystery behind one of the most dramatic chapters in country music history. Because to understand Johnny Cash, you have to understand what really happened at the Opry. Before the world knew him as the Man in Black, Johnny Cash was just a boy from Kingsland, Arkansas, a small-town kid growing up in the middle of the Great Depression. Life on the cotton farm was brutal. Long, hot days under the southern sun, the sound of work songs drifting across the fields. But even then, music was his escape. His mother, Carrie, encouraged him to sing hymns, and his deep voice carried a kind of soul that didn't sound like a child's at all. It sounded like someone who had already seen too much of life. When Johnny left home and joined the Air Force, it gave him structure, but deep down, he knew where his heart belonged. After his service, he moved to Memphis, Tennessee, a city pulsing with the birth of rock and roll. It was there, in 1955, that fate stepped in. He walked into Sun Records, the same studio that had launched Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis, and convinced Sam Phillips to let him audition. Cash's songs were raw and haunting, nothing like the polished Nashville sound of the time. His first big hit, Folsom Prison Blues, wasn't just another country tune. It was something darker, a song written from the perspective of a man behind bars, longing for freedom. It made people stop and listen. And when he followed it with I Walk the Line, a simple, heartfelt promise of loyalty to his first wife, Vivian, Johnny Cash officially became a household name. By 1956, he had earned a spot on the one stage every country artist dreamed of, the Grand Ole Opry. It was the pinnacle of country music, the stage that made legends. For Cash, walking out under those bright lights was more than a performance. It was validation. The farm boy who once picked cotton was now standing shoulder to shoulder with the biggest names in the industry. But beneath the surface, there was already a tension forming. The Opry was built on rules, tradition, and order. Johnny Cash? He was a storm, passionate, unpredictable, and unwilling to fit the mold. And soon that storm was going to collide with the very institution that had crowned him a star. When Johnny Cash first started performing at the Grand Ole Opry, he fit right in, at least on the surface. The audience loved him, his songs were topping the charts, and his name was becoming a regular feature in Nashville. But behind the applause, tension was quietly building. Because while the Opry celebrated the roots of country music, clean-cut performances, family-friendly shows, and artists who followed the rules, Johnny Cash was rewriting what country music could sound like. His style didn't just blend country and gospel, it had an edge, a pulse of rebellion. He mixed in the grit of rockabilly and the soul of folk storytelling. He wasn't afraid to talk about pain, regret, or sin, things most country artists of the time avoided. His voice carried an honesty that didn't need polish. It was rough, raw, and real. And for some at the Opry, that rawness didn't fit the image they wanted to preserve. As the years went on, Cash began to push back against the expectations placed on him. He wasn't the type to smile politely and stick to the script. He played songs the Opry didn't approve of, broke time limits, and even brought an unpredictable energy to the stage that some saw as disrespectful. But for Johnny, it wasn't about disrespect. It was about truth. He once said that he sang to the beaten down, the ignored, and the broken. And sometimes, the truth wasn't pretty. Then came that night. The story that has been told and retold across country music history. During one of his Opry performances, frustrated and exhausted, Johnny reportedly swung his microphone stand and smashed the stage's footlights, shattering glass, shocking the audience, and leaving the Opry management furious. Whether it was pure anger, exhaustion, or a cry for freedom, no one knows for sure. But that act marked a breaking point. It wasn't just a moment of rebellion, it was symbolic. A man at war with the very traditions that had once embraced him. The Opry was about order. Johnny Cash was about chaos that made sense. And from that moment on, the cracks between them were no longer hidden. By the early 1960s, the same fire that made Johnny Cash a star had begun to consume him. The endless touring, the sleepless nights, and the pressure to stay on top all came at a cost. Cash turned to pills, first to stay awake, then to fall asleep, then just to make it through the day. What started as a tool for survival became a full-blown dependence that nearly destroyed him. Behind the stage lights, the man in black was unraveling. His marriage to Vivian Liberto, already strained by distance and fame, began to crumble. Friends and bandmates recalled nights when Johnny seemed like a ghost of himself, eyes heavy, voice hoarse, and spirit fading. He crashed cars, missed shows, and faced arrests for drug possession. But through it all, his fans never stopped believing in him. There was something tragically human about Johnny Cash. His flaws made him more real, more relatable. But for the Grand Ole Opry, an institution built on discipline and image, Johnny's behavior became too much to handle. The Opry had rules. No profanity, no reckless antics, and certainly no destroying property. After the night he smashed the footlights and stormed off the stage, management had seen enough. Reports say he was quietly told not to return. In other words, banned. That word, banned, became legendary. For years, fans debated whether it was official or just a story passed around Nashville. But one thing was clear. Johnny Cash was no longer welcome on the Opry stage. It was a stunning fall from grace for the man who had once been one of its brightest stars. In interviews later in life, Cash admitted that his actions had gone too far, but he also hinted that the Opry needed shaking up, that it had become too safe, too polished. "I was just being myself," he said once. And sometimes that's too much for some people. As his addiction deepened, his career and personal life hit rock bottom. The crowds were smaller, the hits fewer. The man who once ruled the Opry stage was now an outlaw in exile. But fate wasn't done with Johnny Cash just yet, because the very darkness that pushed him away from the Opry would soon lead him to redemption. By the late 1960s, Johnny Cash had reached the breaking point. The drugs, the arrests, the loneliness, it all caught up to him. His once booming career had dwindled, and his name, once praised on the Grand Ole Opry stage, was now whispered with pity. But sometimes, rock bottom becomes the place where a man finds his purpose again. And for Johnny Cash, redemption didn't come from fame or awards. It came from love. That love was June Carter. She had been by his side for years, on tours, on stage, and during his darkest moments. June saw something in Johnny that even he couldn't see anymore. She pushed him to face his demons, to get clean, and to start believing in himself again. It wasn't easy. There were relapses, heartbreaks, and moments when it seemed he'd lose the fight. But slowly, the man behind the black clothes began to re-emerge. Then came one of the most powerful comebacks in music history. In 1968, Johnny Cash stepped into California's Folsom Prison, not as an inmate, but as a performer. The live recording of at Folsom Prison wasn't just a concert. It was a statement. He sang to men who had been forgotten, men who understood pain and redemption better than anyone. The raw emotion of that performance reignited his career and reminded the world who Johnny Cash really was, a voice for the voiceless. When he married June later that same year, it marked the start of a new chapter. He was clean, focused, and finally at peace with who he was. And though the Grand Ole Opry had once turned its back on him, time has a way of healing even the deepest rifts. Eventually, Cash was invited back to perform, proof that both he and the Opry had changed. The institution that once symbolized everything he rebelled against now stood as a place that welcomed him home. And when Johnny Cash walked back onto that stage, the applause wasn't just for his music, it was for the man who had faced the darkness and come out the other side. But even redemption has a shadow, and the story of Johnny Cash and the Opry still held secrets few people ever heard. When Johnny Cash finally stood once more beneath the lights of the Grand Ole Opry, he was no longer the restless young man who had smashed its stage years earlier. He was older, wiser, and worn by life, yet somehow more powerful than ever. The crowd didn't just see a performer that night. They saw a man who had lived through fire and come back to tell the tale. Cash's return to the Opry wasn't marked by spectacle or rebellion. It was quiet, humble, and deeply symbolic. The institution that once couldn't contain him now honored him as one of its greatest legends. It was as if both sides had finally met in the middle. The Opry had modernized, and Cash had made peace with his past. His performance that night was filled with gratitude, and for the first time, the rebellious man in black stood not as an outcast, but as a cornerstone of country music itself. By this time, Johnny Cash had become larger than any single stage. He was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and the Gospel Hall of Fame, a rare trifecta that proved just how wide his reach had become. But what truly set him apart wasn't the awards or accolades. It was the way his songs spoke to people who had been forgotten. He didn't just sing to his audience, he sang for them. The Opry episode, though painful, became part of his legend. It reflected the eternal push and pull within country music, between tradition and change, control and freedom, respectability and truth. Johnny Cash stood right in the middle of that tension, unafraid to show the cracks, unafraid to bleed. When he sang The Man in Black, he wasn't just describing a stage persona, he was revealing his soul. He wore black for the poor, the broken, the ones left behind. That honesty is what made him timeless. The Grand Ole Opry may have been his proving ground, but the world became his stage. And in the end, Johnny Cash didn't just return to country music, he redefined it forever. Rumors suggest that the infamous banning wasn't as clear-cut as many believe. Some reports claim the Opry never formally banned him at all, that it was more of an unofficial exile, a quiet understanding that he needed time away. Others say management was furious but also heartbroken, knowing that Cash's outburst came from exhaustion and addiction rather than malice. What's certain is that, for years, he stayed away by choice, embarrassed by his actions, and unsure if he'd ever be welcomed back. There are also stories of how deeply that separation affected him. Friends recalled how, even at the height of his fame, Johnny would sometimes mention the Opry with a distant look, half regret, half longing. For all his rebellious image, He respected what that stage stood for. It was where he'd been accepted when he had nothing. Losing it, even temporarily, cut deeper than most people realized. It's also been said that June Carter played a quiet role in smoothing things over. She was a longtime Opry favorite and part of its most beloved family. Reports claim she helped bridge the gap between Cash and the Opry's leadership, softening old wounds and eventually helping open the door for his return. And then there's the most powerful truth of all. Johnny Cash never ran from his mistakes. He faced them. In interviews, he didn't deny what happened. He owned it. He said, "I was just in a bad way, but I never stopped loving the Opry." That honesty is what made him so different. His flaws didn't erase his greatness, they deepened it. Because the story of Johnny Cash and the Opry isn't just about rebellion or redemption. It's about a man who fell, learned, and rose again, and in doing so, left behind one of the most unforgettable legacies in country music history. In the end, the story of Johnny Cash and the Grand Ole Opry is not one of shame or scandal. It's a story of growth, defiance, and forgiveness. It's the story of a man who refused to pretend, who stood firm in his truth, even when that truth was messy and hard to face. The Opry represented the purest form of country tradition, but Johnny Cash represented the restless heart beating beneath it. And sometimes, those two worlds simply couldn't exist side by side. Cash's journey, from the cotton fields of Arkansas to the polished stage of the Opry, from addiction and exile to spiritual rebirth, mirrors the story of country music itself. It's a music born out of struggle, faith, and redemption. And no one embodied those themes more completely than Johnny Cash. When the Opry doors finally opened to him again, it wasn't just a welcome home. It was a symbol that even the fallen could find grace, and that country music still had room for the broken-hearted and the misunderstood. To this day, fans still talk about that night he shattered the Opry's footlights. Some call it rebellion, others call it the moment he set himself free. But maybe it was something deeper, the breaking of an old image, a spark that would later light the path to a more honest, more human kind of country music. Johnny Cash would go on to inspire generations who came after him, artists who saw that country didn't have to be perfect to be powerful. His voice carried the sound of pain, faith, and forgiveness, all wrapped into one. And perhaps that's the real lesson of his story, that greatness isn't born from playing it safe. It's born from standing tall in your flaws, singing your truth, and never backing down from who you are. So when we ask, what really happened to Johnny Cash from the Grand Ole Opry? The answer is simple. He lived. He fell. He rose again. And in doing so, he turned one of country music's biggest controversies into one of its most timeless legends.